We are barreling on through these genealogies, and before you know it, we'll be back into more familiar territory with some narratives. But hopefully you've seen, though, over the last few chapters that while reading these genealogies may in itself be a bit uninteresting, that does not mean that they are unimportant. There are often real gems within these genealogies and interesting, relevant observations that we can make. One noteworthy thing about chapter 7 is that this chapter introduces the language of fighting men. That is, trained soldiers from these various tribes. We've been told a little bit about some battles that took place in previous chapters, but this is the first chapter that really evokes the idea that Israel was once a fighting force, under the leadership of Joshua in particular, but also under the leadership of Saul and David and Solomon. Israel was once the dominant force in the region, able to defend their people and ensure their place in the promised land. They literally put the fear of God into these evil enemy nations that surrounded them. Do you remember how before they came into the promised land, it was occupied by the Canaanites, and the spies that went into the land ended up staying in Rahab's house in Jericho? She told them, "Us Canaanites, we are terrified of you Israelites, because we have heard what your God has done and how you have defeated armies much bigger and better equipped than your own." There was a time in Israel's past when they were confident that the Lord would fight for them because they lived their lives in glad obedience to him. All those ideas are being evoked in this chapter as it talks so much about fighting men. Verse 2, verse 5, verse 7, and in verse 11. Now, just think of how that sounds to those who have just come back from Babylonian exile. They have been on the receiving end of somebody else's military might. They are well acquainted with what it is like to be weak in the world and subject to the sinful impulses of those more powerful than them. But God is more powerful still, and he is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. And the same God who called Israel out of Egypt has now called Israel out of Babylon. And the Israel that was escaping Egypt, do you remember? That they had no familiarity with fighting. They had spent 400 years in slavery. Not one of them had any experience in the military. They all had to learn on the job what it was like to go to war and win battles by relying wholeheartedly on God. The same is true for this current generation, most of whom have been born in exile, some of whom would remember the days before the exile and would likely have a huge amount of grief and trauma and fear about the last time an army came face to face with the Israelites. Is it possible that God might again raise up in this generation the kinds of fighters that he raised up in previous generations? Is it possible that one day we might hold our own once again, not by our strength, but by the power of God? Well, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. God is able to do extraordinary things through utterly ordinary people. If he did it back then, he can do it today. Now that is a lesson that we need to learn again in each generation. Just as they were being encouraged to look back at their own history, that they might long that God would do the same today, so we can look back on our own history and see how God poured out his grace in days gone by. We read about God doing amazing things, don't we, in the life of the Christian church. We read about times of spiritual awakenings and times of revival. We read about great preachers of the past and great moves of the Holy Spirit. And we might well be thinking to ourselves, well, you know what, that sounds great for them, but that could never happen today. But in thinking like that, we reveal just how little faith we have and just how little we think of the living God. It is true that not only God can do these great things, but that he already is. At this moment, all over the world, people are pouring into the kingdom. The size of God's family only ever grows, and right now more and more people are joining it. They are turning from their sin and putting their faith in Jesus. They are gladly submitting to living their lives in a way that honors him. It has never been more true than it is right now, that all over the world the gospel is growing and bearing fruit. God is saving thousands of people in China and India and in many places across Africa and lots of other parts around the world. He can do the same thing in the UK. He can do the same thing in the USA. He can do the same thing wherever he wants, whenever he wants. The question is not, is God able? The question is, are we faithful? Israel won these wars with their fighting men when they trusted in God, and they failed when they lived in unrepentant sin. And so may we learn from their mistakes. May we turn wholeheartedly from our sin and ask Jesus to work powerfully in our day and age to save many people for the glory of his name.